Thanks, Paula. Just so everyone knows who I am, my name is Madhu Anand. I am with the New York State Department of Health and one of the co-directors of our Integrated Food Safety Center of Excellence. So I'm going to start sharing. Oops, hold on one second. Start sharing my slides in one moment. Can everyone see my slides okay? Paula, can you just give me a yes?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So the New York Integrated Food Safety Center of Excellence is a partnership between the New York State Department of Health and Cornell University. And we serve it up. We are one of 4 COEs in the country. And we service primarily from Maine down to West Virginia. That being said, we really thought it would be a good idea to go over how to start up a student interview team, because we've been getting a lot of questions about how to start one. And so what we have done is we've created some resources aimed at advising state and jurisdictional departments of public health on processes to implement student interview teams, and kind of go into some of the considerations that you might want to think of, whether that is implementing them remotely or in person at your agency. What we're going to present can be applied on a state level or a local level. Some of the items we talk about might apply themselves a little bit better at the state level, but still are transferable to both levels. And so what the, for lack of a better word, toolkit entails is 2 different checklists. It's a student intern logistics checklist that really gets at more the planning stages of bringing on students and interns, and that incorporates logistical and budget and infrastructure considerations. And that's supplemented by a student team orientation checklist as well. The student team orientation checklist highlights the activities and tools to develop those fundamental interviewing skills, and also references supplemental documents that might be helpful if adapted for your agency, such as disease information worksheets, instructions for use of Google Voice, as well as a number of different other different items. So without further ado, I'm really going to dive into that first checklist that we spoke of, the one that's the logistical considerations. And I think one of the things that we really want to highlight when you're starting to think about logistics is really making sure you're allowing enough lead time to communicate with your partners and with management if you're creating a new student interview team at your agency. And so what we'll talk about are 4 kind of buckets, so to speak, of consideration for logistics. One would be recruitment, then supervision specifics, post-recruitment training considerations. So this is before a student, is fully on board, but after you've selected them and kind of what you might need to think about. And then workspace considerations. And the reason we mentioned workspace is, sometimes that drives some of the other pieces in the checklist as well. So I'll start off with the recruitment portion of things. And before I actually even really get into the entire piece, I'm gonna bring up the checklist, which Paula will show you where those are located on our website a little later on in the presentation. So one of the things we wanted to say is these checklists are not in any sequential or chronological order. And there really here is a template for you to adapt for your own agency. And so just to have those as reminders that a lot of these activities might either be going on at the same time or not necessarily in this order. So the first item we have under recruitment is determining your method of recruitment. So you might, you've got to basically determine how you're going to market getting students in the door. And so a variety of ways we've found helpful, as well as we've heard from other states and centers of excellence, is through advertising through specific schools, through specific known professors, other school contacts, listservs that target schools or students, or job posting bulletin boards. Like an example is Emory's Public Health Employment Connection. So just to give you our own example, we work pretty closely with both School of Public Health and Cornell. And so with the UAlbany School of Public Health, we know that their students are required to complete a certain amount of practical experience or internship experience, and they routinely send out a call for internship applications and post those at designated times throughout the year. So that's something we work pretty closely with. We also have professors that, that are known to us and that will work through just to say, hey, if you happen to know, we're looking for students. If you happen to know any good students that might be looking, send them our way, type of thing as well. And then sometimes schools will also have, as I mentioned, these listservs where they're sending out opportunities to their broader student community, and that can also be a good way to market. Another item that you may want to consider is determining the eligibility criteria for student recruits. Whether or not being in an undergraduate program might be fine, or if you're really looking for a graduate student, or maybe you're looking for a mix of both. And so, who you decide on will depend on what level of skill you might be looking for and how much you might be able to train them. And so, and what your different needs are. Sometimes undergraduates may not require a specific project, whereas a graduate student might. And again, that may all play a role in determining the number of students you'd want to recruit. Determining whether or not the student will be paid or unpaid or volunteer for their work or internship. And so some of the things that you want to think about, sorry, I missed one. Determine number of students to be recruited. So the number of students may be dependent on supervision capacity, experience of the supervisor, and space capacity. For a new or inexperienced supervisor, we often recommend starting really slow and just enrolling 1 or 2 students maximum. Sometimes it is easier to go with 2 students because they can kind of play off one another and kind of have a buddy system. But, we definitely recommend starting slow and building your program. And certainly if you don't have a lot of bandwidth within your current department, you might not have a lot of people available to be a supervisor, you'll definitely want to take that into consideration. So then moving back to determining whether the student will be paid or unpaid for their work or internship, this is where you really want to kind of determine do you want, for instance, here at New York State Department of Health, often what we'll do is we'll have a student start as a volunteer before we would go ahead and use either our grant or state monies to pay them, kind of give them like a proof of concept, initially just to make sure that, we're using our dollars efficiently. We're also pretty lucky in that our University at Albany School of Public Health does provide something called the Public Health Leaders of Tomorrow, or FLOT funding, for some of the internship applications that come through their door. It is a competitive process, and those are often internships that are that have a high amount of applications for them. But sometimes the school will also have funds that they can utilize to fund some of the internships as well. You also want to consider whether the students might be able to receive benefits if they are being paid. And you might also want to determine where funds are coming from if you do have that capacity to pay them, and whether they'll come from a grant, the state, the local health department, the school, for instance. You'll need to determine if you'll enroll students who need to complete a project as part of their internship experience or for credit. And so some considerations on if you're going to enroll students who need a project is the time they might need to complete that project, what resources they need, their ability to develop a defined project, their access to data, and agreement between the agency and the student on how data can be shared outside the department. So those are all things to kind of think about if you can enroll a student who might need a project. One of the key items is determining how long a student would be hired. So options include for a semester or a break, at a time, or maybe you say, nope, I don't want to have to keep restarting the recruitment process, so I want a commitment for a full academic year. Depending on what you decide, you may also need to develop you will need to develop a continuation plan for those times when students might be more likely to have school exams, or when there might be school breaks and the student might not be available to work. So, one of the things we often say to students, especially when they're coming on board, is, for instance, during the summertime, we say, everyone deserves a vacation. We definitely don't mind if you take a vacation. But if we're having more than one student and we need coverage, we just ask that you let us know ahead of time so that we can plan. And so just, those are some things that we think about when not necessarily taking somebody on, but, if they're going to be out most of the time on vacations, then maybe they're, we're not the best match for each other. The next item is develop recruitment materials so you can get applications in. So, you can market your internship or opportunity. So you might want to put out flyers, emails, an intern position description, which we all have some template language for that can be adapted as needed if you're looking for something. Then you want to develop the application process. You want to consider how students will apply, when they'll apply, whether or not you're requesting they submit a resume, whether or not you're going to require an interview of the student. And I think one of the biggest things here that people underestimate is the length of time for that whole application process. And then finally, if you require any prerequisite skills or courses. So just to give you an idea of the application process, for the University of Albany School of Public Health, right now, we are getting a call for applications for the fall. So that's at least a 2-month lead time for starting to put some of this together. So just something to consider, the timelines. You may need to, if you want to start one off, you might need to have a discussion with some of the institutions you're working with on what their timeline looks like. So if you do decide that you want your students to interview with you before you select them, you need to develop your interview process, which would also incorporate developing an interviewing tool or questions. So ours has been pretty casual. We do have a few discrete questions that we ask when we're interviewing students, but it's more to get a sense of, what their interests are, how well they're able to communicate with somebody else, especially since they'll be interviewing somebody over the phone. And so so if you can think of some questions that you might be able to, one, just have a conversation with the student, but also kind of assess both your needs and the student needs. Usually those are pretty good. It doesn't have to be super intense. And our interviews can last anywhere from, 20 minutes to, 50 minutes, depending on how involved we get. You'll want to determine what the student work hours will be, how many hours a week you'll require the student to work. Keep in mind that if they are doing it for credit, that the school might require a certain number of hours for credit. You might also want to consider whether they would work outside of normal work hours, such as weekends and evenings. Here at New York State, we do require that students put in some outside of normal work hour time. If you enroll multiple students, you will decide whether they'll be working, you'll need to decide whether you'll be working at the same time, overlapping or staggered. And when we say that, we can mean both within a week, for instance, if they're working the same days and hours, overlapping, or, staggered. But that could also mean semester by semester or term by term as well. You'll have to decide whether you will allow students to work when their supervisor is not on site as well, and kind of determine what your agency policy is regarding that. And then finally, complete any paperwork required by the school for each student. So then our next section is our supervision specifics. So going into supervision specifics, which is a much shorter section, really our recruitment section is our longest section to the checklist. But our supervision specifics are determining the number of supervisors available to mentor and supervise a student. And that'll really be dependent on your agency and what your needs are. You'll need to determine how the supervisors will be trained and who at your agency will train those supervisors. You'll need to determine the criteria for supervisor availability, decide whether supervisors will be required to be present in the office with students or if they can offer support remotely, and decide whether supervisors are required to be available on evenings and weekends if that's when you're having your students working. I think this is, it's one line in supervision specifics, a short section, but I think in this remote world, this is a pretty big item now. And thinking through kind of how are you going to supervise if there is this remote capacity, either for the supervisor or the student. You'll need to consider the need to identify and assign a mentor or partner to the student during their first week of hire. Because we're lucky enough to have students last with us more than a semester sometimes, we are able to kind of, with a new student, buddy them up with a student that's been here for a little while that can kind of show them the ropes, and it also makes training them a little bit easier. So you might not have that capacity or capability right away, but just something to consider. So then our next section is, once you've decided on the students that you want to have on board, what are the training considerations for them? So you want to develop or adapt the student orientation checklist that Paula will be presenting on. Really, assessing them for your agency specific processes and protocols. One of the reasons we put these together as a checklist is and made sure that they were available in Word, is we know that there's going to be specifics that we're not going to cover for each agency that need to be incorporated in. You're going to want to establish a method and timing of in-person student training, deciding who at your agency will provide training, deciding whether training will be delivered every semester or yearly. If students are beginning internships at the same time, you might want to consider just providing one single in-person training for all students. I know we have like a orientation day where we get through like a lot of the administrative and a lot of the 101 items. If students have a staggered start to their internships, they could train each other, so a train the trainer approach, especially if you do have that more seasoned student that's bleeding into when a new student is starting. And then establish how long it'll take the student to complete the trainings, whether you really want them to have a good foundation before they get going, whether that's 2 weeks, 1 week, 1 day. It'll also be determined based on your capacity. I think that's kind of important as well, because on one hand they're hired to do interviews, but you want to make sure that they've got a solid foundation in being able to conduct those interviews. And then figuring out how you're going to implement quality assurance and evaluation program components. So basically, how are you going to evaluate them, right? So what methods are you going to use to evaluate them? Are you going to review their completed case reports to ensure they're completing a case report like you'd like them to? Are you going to shadow their phone calls so you can provide them tips and tricks as they get more comfortable conducting interviews? Are you going to track the number of interviews assigned versus the number that they completed? Keeping in mind the number of hours they're working. So just to think about a couple of those items on how you're going to ensure that they're providing good quality interviews as well. And then developing just the general expectations and performance criteria and priorities for the student. So some general expectations include notifying the employer of tardiness or absence, how they would do that, dressing appropriately according to workplace policies, how to speak professionally while on the phone. Some performance criteria could include making sure they're checking email at the start of the workday and throughout the day, that they're following established procedures, that they're reaching out to a supervisor if they're looking for additional work. And then some priorities hierarchy. So you would need to determine if a student had multiple tasks to complete, which tasks would take priority. So, we say interviews take priority, but, if you're waiting for a call back or you're waiting to do a second or third call, then maybe then you would work on data cleaning. And if, you're done with that, then get to this activity. So you really do need to help them. Remember, these are students, and so this might be their first time in a real world setting. And so you really are setting the stage for what their professional world is going to look like, and kind of helping them understand what's expected of them. And then The next item is providing or developing, if it's not available, organization charts to assist the student in basically understanding where they fit into the big picture of the organization and public health and what their task is. So you probably want to kind of give them a discussion about the comprehensive activities within the enteric program or infectious disease department, beyond their role as a student interviewer. Really, one of the things we've found, because so many of our students that we recruit require a paper or some sort of report at the end of their internship activity, is they're so focused on the task, they lose sight of what the big picture is. And so that's something that we now, try to keep in mind and make sure that they have a better understanding of as they're going through the process. We definitely include them in different conference calls in our regular meetings so they understand kind of the broader view of public health. And then I'm coming into the last part of the checklist, which is the workspace considerations. You want to determine whether the students will be working on-site, remotely, or a combination of both, which we would call a hybrid model. You want to secure the desk spaces, computers, telephone lines for a student working on site. And if you have multiple students, determining whether or not they'll need to share space or have their own space or equipment. I know that, we have, increasingly we're having more limited space on our floor for students. And so, in the past, we've definitely shared space. We went through a period where they were able to have their own dedicated space. And now we're back to students kind of sharing spaces. So where we might have some students who work like, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we'll have other students that work Tuesday, Thursday, and they'll be able to use the same workspace. You also want to determine how the student's gonna access the required resources if working remotely. So the things to consider, like, is your surveillance system able to be accessed remotely? Are the interview questionnaires or the template interview questionnaires someplace they can have access to them remotely if they need to? Any guidance materials or timesheets they would need to complete. You're going to also need to assess whether students will have access to a home computer and a telephone line. And, we do have some solutions that we've utilized. And so things that, if you are thinking of having a remote student, is considering using SharePoint or a VPN, having them have access to a VPN or a token that allows them to get into the agency network. If your agency uses any cloud-based being able to access documents in a cloud, being able to utilize Google Voice, which I know we talked about within New York, to our local health departments in New York State recently, but Paula will go into a document that we have that can serve as a resource as well for setting up phone lines via Google Voice. You also want to ensure that the student workspaces are sufficiently private for their interviews. Unfortunately, again, as we're getting a little bit more crowded at New York State, we're finding it harder to find optimal spots for that. And so sometimes it's because everyone on the floor does go through, confidentiality training, and we're pretty much all within the Bureau of Communicable Disease Control. It's okay if we overhear portions of it, but, we all know that, we have a need to know, but it is something you want to consider, especially if you're placing the student maybe not directly within your offices. You want to ensure student workspaces are located in an area that will not disturb other staff, as students will be speaking on the phone for the majority of their workday. So that's something also to consider. It can be, it can get, you know, a little loud at times. One other thing that we realized as time moved on was considering student accessibility to the workplace. So where we work, the parking sucks. It really does. It's not very good. And a lot of times public transportation is the best way to get to our building. And so we definitely are pretty blunt during student interviews in letting them know what those accessibility options are. And we basically say, you know, there is an expectation that you get here. This is how you would get here. If this isn't the right office space for you, then, you know, let us know. Maybe not so bluntly we say that, but that is the undertone. So then the final item we have is determining workplace policies and paperwork that need to be completed by the student. So, you know, these are, you know, the things every employee needs to complete, right? So, you know, what you need to do to secure an ID badge, how you would access the IT infrastructure at the department. So I know we have to go through here at the department, we need, you know, just general network access. Then we need to make sure we have access to our secure system. Then we need to have access to, you know, our surveillance system. So making sure that you've got all the different levels of access that are needed. And then ensuring completion of confidentiality training. And then finally, considering whether paperwork needs to be completed before or after their start date. And it might be a combination of both. So I think what I'll do is I'll bring up the presentation. And what we'll do is we'll have Paula go over to, I'll stop sharing and have Paula go over to more of the student orientation checklist piece of things before we start to entertain questions. I can see it, Paula.
Great, thanks. All right, so I'll pick up where Madhu left off. In basically what I'm going to cover is the student or intern orientation checklist, which again, as mentioned, it will highlight the activities and tools to develop fundamental interviewing skills with the new student or interns. It's based on our New York State model, but we did make good attempts to modify each task so it can be generalizable to other state or jurisdictional health departments. And it is based off of our student team orientation packet, which is about 32 pages long. And essentially what I'm going to break down in the checklist embodies what is in that packet, but the packet is super specific to the New York State Department of Health, our policies, our surveillance systems. But again, we can share this with you if you, you know, think it would be of help to look at. And again, this checklist that I'm going to go over is pretty much that, that packet made to be more generalizable. It's broken into sections, which I'll go through. And then as we go through the checklist, I can show you a couple of the supplemental sheets that accompany it, which includes worksheets in the Google Voice. I'm going to stop sharing that. And I'm going to bring up the checklist. Okay, so again, this is the student or intern orientation checklist, and it's really once you have one student or more in place at your agency, how do you get them up to speed so they are ready to begin doing the job you need them to do? So first off is just giving them some, making sure they have that basic disease information knowledge. And this section focuses on tasks so that they become familiar with the communicable diseases for which they will be conducting case interviews. They will have required readings to complete. They should have completed exercises based on those required readings, and I will show you an example in one moment. Once they complete those exercises on their own, it's best to have, the student and their mentor review the exercise together so they can see, what they answered right, if they answered anything wrong, to correct it, or if they needed more information about anything. And, best information or best instruction for life is, we can't know everything all the time about everything. We can try, but it doesn't work. So really, you want to understand how to, and make sure the student understands how to access reference material to look up information on diseases or processes. I still have to look up incubation periods sometimes. It's just one of those things. So what manuals to reference, what websites to look at. We don't want them to look at Google. We want them to consult, CDC or FDA. But again, like Madhu mentioned, this may be the students, first time in a workplace, not in school, and they need to be, explicitly told some of these things. And I'm not going to hop around too much, but I do want to just show the disease information worksheet that I alluded to, which is here. So we kind of spell it out as in, refer to this book. You're going to look up these certain diseases as you read through them. There's different questions for each one that they're going to have to complete. So they're going to go through each one and kind of fill out this grid. There's also some additional information about where to find, the information if they need to, aside from the Communicable Disease Manual, CDC website, and then reviewing some of our state-specific protocols. Basically, just a worksheet for them to go over, again, tailored to the diseases for which they may or may not, be interviewing for. Then the next section has to do with, getting into the nitty gritty. They have the disease background understanding. Now, it's time to interview protocols and procedures. So first you want to make sure that the student has reviewed confidentiality and privacy issues regarding performing case interviews. And then another big one is the student understands how to set up their cell phone or laptop with any systems needed for after hours or weekend calls, text, voicemails. As we all know, 9 to 5 isn't always the best time to reach cases. Google Voice is a really helpful instrument that we use here. Again, we have a document, and I already included in the chat the link to these materials, and in there you'll see the Google Voice protocol. And really, it's not really worthy of showing here necessarily, but it literally goes step by step, so someone can set up their cell phone or laptop such that when they call a person, the number that the caller sees or can return a call or text to is not that actual person's number, just so they're not giving out a lot of times they're not given a state agency phone, so they're using their own personal phone, and we don't want them to have that number disclosed to the cases. So it's a really helpful way to have a different number linked to the phone that then is used for the correspondence, to keep it private for the personal number. Obviously, a big one is to have the student trained on the surveillance system that you have in place at your facility. We use a system called CDES here in New York State. I know others use Maven or RedCap, and so likely, they will need the training in your specific surveillance system. You have to set up a system so that they know how to retrieve new interview requests or assignments from the systems being utilized. If interviews are being requested, but they don't have a way to access them, that would be a problem. And then the student understands the need to identify pertinent case information at the get-go. So they want to make sure they know, the primary language of the case, the age of the case to know whether they will be talking to the case or potentially a parent, occupation, just so they can maybe gear up if it's a sensitive setting, and we'll talk about that later. And then outcome disposition. Usually we don't have too many cases that pass away, but you definitely want to be aware of that ahead of time if in fact they did, to not ask for the case by name when you call the household. The student will most certainly run up to a case who English is not their primary language, so you will want them to understand the process you have in place at your facility for like a translation service or a language line, so that they can complete the interview. Student is able to apply exclusion principles based on the state guidance for high risk or sensitive settings. So say they work as a food handler, or they are in a daycare, or they give direct patient care. So for certain diseases, as we all know, STEC, Salmonella, Shigella, there may be restrictions in place. So they have to, stay excluded until they have certain clearance testing. And again, that's something you want to train them on, in the beginning before they start the interviews. And then that way, when they do reach someone who works in a sensitive setting, they're able to apply those principles. We also have in our orientation packet some examples of sample dialogues for initiating an interview based on who they're going to be speaking with when they're doing the interview. Often it's the case themselves, but clearly not always. And so you kind of do have to at least initiate the conversation differently, whether you're talking to the case themselves, whether you're talking to a surrogate, whether you're talking to the case's parent or guardian, or another proxy. So it just goes through the different examples of how you might want to start the conversation when it's not the case, or how to kind of flow between the two. You may start out asking for the case, but you have their surrogate, and just to kind of get that verbiage, an example for these individuals who may, again, this may be their first time conducting interviews. You want students to be familiar with the case investigation forms that they're going to be using. Again, they differ between whether it's Salmonella or STEC, Listeria, and you really want to make sure they've read them over, they know how to pronounce everything, they know what each food item or exposure means, because they will be asked these questions. Back in the day, hummus was one not everybody knew. Everybody knows it now, but we're adding new exposures to the forms, what seems all the time. And just, you want to make sure that you know what the items are, so if you are asked, you can describe it. And then at every agency, I'm sure the process may fluctuate a little bit, but we certainly don't get every case on the first attempt. And so what is your process that you're going to follow? How many times are you going to call a case? What times of day do you want to stagger the times of day? You don't always want to call every day. So here in New York, we attempt 4 times. And we want the times to be spread out. So maybe a morning call, an afternoon call, an evening call, and then, one other time, but you don't want to call the same exact time every day. It's likely that they're at work or unable to take the call at that time. When to leave a voicemail, or when to leave a text, and then what information to leave in a voicemail or text. So again, like Madhu mentioned, we do have some, example standard language we use in ours that we are perfectly willing and able to share. So just reach out to us if that's the case. And this way, it's pretty consistent between students or interns of what what verbiage they're using in the text so it sounds professional, but it's short and it gets the information across that it needs to. The student understands how to schedule or reschedule an interview. Oftentimes, a case may answer the phone, but they're unable to go through the interviews, which now, last upwards of 30 to 45 minutes. So you don't just want to say, okay, thanks, bye. You definitely want to make sure you get that reschedule, time to reschedule to do it. Student is able to complete a case interview and understands which questions are required. Usually all questions are required, but at least knows kind of the skip patterns if there are those, or when details are needed to be collected. They also need to understand how to track and document the status of the interview request and attempt. So I like to know, like when I'm waiting for an interview, how many times has the case been called. Maybe I can see, oh, okay, they've already been called twice, and we're waiting on a couple more times. But each attempt is documented, so it's not, you can kind of see where you are in that workflow of 4 calls, voicemails, texts, before they're deemed the dreaded lost to follow up. We also have our students complete mock interviews with, hopefully, if you have more than one student, they can bounce it back and forth between each other. But, sometimes if you only have the one student, then there will need to be a staff member involved. But, essentially the mock interviews are you pull up, one of the interview forms that they'll be using, maybe Salmonella, and then, one person is the interviewer, one is the interviewee, and then you kind of swap roles so they get to experience both sides of the coin. And when you're serving as the interviewee, it's helpful to have someone with a little bit of experience in that role, if you can, just to give the interviewer, a little bit of real life in there. If you just kind of go through, maybe be nice the first time, the first form you can go through pretty basic, but after that, give them someone who, be someone who has poor recall, be someone who's not super thrilled about being called, but see how that person can kind of finesse the conversation so they get, an interview out of the person. Someone who keeps getting off track, with exposures or stories, how does that interviewer loop them back to the questionnaire? And again, reviewing that the student or intern knows how to apply the sensitive setting policies for those specific diseases, because once they have them on the phone, again, that's the time to do it. There are a couple videos that are excellent and entertaining on kind of the do's and don'ts of interviewing, one out of Colorado and one out of Oregon, and the links are embedded within the checklist. So again, we have in the orientation packet, we have these as required exercises to do. And then again, the student, this is just kind of something we put in there as just a generalizable one. So for you at your agency to just, in this part, make sure the student has reviewed any agency-specific required protocols, not specifically mentioned here. And then other certain generalizable ones where a student understands what to do if they call a case and there's some sort of health or safety of the individual that's being compromised. Does the student know what to do with that? What staff member to report that to? And then just in general, the student needs to have someone who they feel comfortable and who, will be available to answer their questions should they have it. They're going to have questions, and if they feel like there's no one to approach to ask, they're just going to kind of pick a solution they think is right. And it may not be right, or, so you just want to make sure they have 1 or 2 staff members they can, come to with questions. And so that way they can learn and do it right. So once they have completed the interview or completed all of the attempts to interview, they just need to know what now. So they need to know that once it's completed successfully, how to save, update the record in the system, the electronic reporting system being used. It's probably mixed at our agency of who fills out the forms just when they're doing the interview online. I think the more you become familiar with the form, then the easier it is to fill it directly online. But there's still a lot of students who, you know, complete a paper form and then will go back to fill in the data. And either it's fine, just that they know how to get the data in there, save the data, and importantly, notifying, you know, whoever at your agency is following that cluster so that you then know the interview has been complete. If they did do a paper form, you know, what do they do with that? We don't want them putting it in their backpack and going home with it. So where do they store that finished paper form? And at the same time that they're kind of filing away the completion, you can also check for missed interview requests at this time, just as sort of a checks and balances system. And then the last section here really just pertains to the outbreak or cluster interviews, some special considerations when you're on that non-initial interview. So you've had your initial interview for a case, you know, either it's been conducted by the local health department or some other entity, but now there's enough cases that they're moving on to a, you know, focused questionnaire, a hypothesis generating questionnaire. Again, the same principles will really all apply. You want the student to know how to be able to retrieve and assign the outbreak request, how to track the document, and document the status of the outbreak. So is it pending? Is it completed? What's, you know, the same tracking mechanisms you use, but this time, because it's an outbreak form, you know, maybe in a different space in the network than where your initial form records are kept. Just knowing some of the nuances of those outbreak questionnaires, especially in outbreak questionnaires, it's really paramount that all questions have a documented answer. And then just knowing certain fields, you know, that it's just easier if the student is able to know what to put in those. We can always go back and correct it, but we really want the student to understand, you know, what's the PulseNet ID, what's the state ID, you know, what do those mean, where do they find them, just so they can populate those fields correctly. Following completion, the student knows how to update the final outcome, again, if it's completed or lost the follow-up, and then they know how to get that information back to whoever is the staff member at their facility following the outbreak. And that's the end of that checklist. And again, I know Madhu had mentioned it. I'll mention it again. The disclaimer at the end here, just, you know, this list is pretty inclusive of the steps we take here at the State Health Department, and it was vetted by those who are intimately involved in TCB here, which stands for Team Cluster Buster. But again, at your facility, you may have additional, you know, grids you want to add. Some of these may not apply. Like Madhu mentioned, they're not in any particular order necessarily. This one a little bit more so than the one she was pointing out. But again, they're entirely modifiable to fit how they would best serve your facility. I'm going to stop sharing that. And so so those are the checklists. We'll take any questions that came in after this, but I just wanted to summarize that again, that what we just showed, they're targeted to enteric disease public health professionals looking to implement a student interviewing team at your agency. Again, they do encompass most of the steps to be considered, but again, entirely modifiable to add or delete. Any of them that wouldn't apply at your facility. They have links within them to some of the resources that we use here. So some of the videos we train our students with, some of the Google Voice document, the exercise sheet, and then they can all be accessed currently, and I put it in the chat as well on the All COE website, and I brought, I can show you what it looks like there. I'll show you that in a second. I'll just finish the last slide. But obviously, contact us with any questions at any time, or if you want to, again, the packet itself, that's about 30 pages long or so, which these checklists are based off of, but if are very New York specific. If you wanted to see those, we can send that to you. And then the last thing I'll share is just on the website here. This is the Integrated Food Safety Centers of Excellence website. They will be up on our New York CoE website as well. It's just going through a platform transformation at the moment. So we're kind of waiting till it completes that step, and then everything gets moved over to the new system. So for the time being, it's all available here, and it's just as easy to click on this link, I suppose. So it'll bring you to the little blurb about it, checklist to initiate student interview teams, and then you'll see the logistics checklist that Madhu had went over, the orientation checklist. I just went over that disease information worksheet, and then the Google Voice setup instructions. So I realize we don't have tons of time for questions, but what I'm going to do is stop sharing, and I'm going to, I think I'm going to end the recording, and we can take some questions that came in.